Hi, I'm Professor Bryan Van Norden of Vassar College, and this is What Can We Learn from Ancient Philosophers, hosted by One Day University. I'm going to start today with a famous painting by Raphael, The School of Athens, and this is a classic work of early Renaissance art. As you can see at this time, Renaissance artists were learning to use perspective, and we know who many of the philosophers in this painting are supposed to be. There are a few mysteries, but many of them we can identify. Right in front of the focal point of the painting in the back there's an older gentleman that's supposed to be Plato, and then there's a middle-aged gentleman next to him that's supposed to be Aristotle. We'll talk about them more in just a second, but to our left, you can see a chubby figure who's balding. That's supposed to be Socrates. Then there's a feminine figure in the foreground. That is supposed to be the ancient woman philosopher Hypatia. Actually, Raphael's patron did not want there to be a woman in the painting, so Raphael told him it was actually just a man with long hair, but we know it's supposed to be the ancient female philosopher Hypatia. And then over on the left, there's a person with a garland in his hair. That's supposed to be Epicurus, the founder of Epicureanism. And then in the foreground, there's someone looking over someone's shoulders taking notes, and that's supposed to be the Islamic philosopher Averroes. So it's a really fascinating painting because it's multicultural, centuries before multiculturalism became a major movement. But I want us to focus in particular on the two figures who are right in front of the focal point in the painting. The older gentleman on our left, gesturing up, is supposed to be Plato, and the middle-aged gentleman next to him gesturing down towards the earth is his student Aristotle. And this is intentionally symbolic. So Plato is gesturing up, reflecting the fact that Platonic philosophy is about transcending your attachment to particular things in the world, transcending your attachment to your physical desires, and also, very importantly, transcending your attachment to common sense views and following reason wherever it may lead you. In contrast, although Aristotle was Plato's student, he had a very different perspective on philosophy, and that's reflected in the fact that he's gesturing down towards the earth. He's saying, no, life is about enjoying this world, the physical world that we inhabit, and satisfying our physical desires in a moderate way, and also achieving goals in the communities we live in here on earth. And if you look really carefully here, you see that each of them is holding a book. The book Plato's holding is the Timaeus, and that's a book in which Plato argues that you can understand the true nature of the world through mathematics. Also, the Timaeus is the first place in Western history where we hear about Atlantis. And my students are often kind of disappointed to find out that Atlantis is a myth that was made up by Plato. And if you read Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus, and then the following one also about the Atlantis, Critias, it's very clear that the story of Atlantis, a continent in the Atlantic that had a great civilization but then sank beneath the sea, is clearly intended as a myth. And Plato was our only real source for the myth of Atlantis. But in any case, he's holding the Timaeus, and then Aristotle is holding a copy of the Nicomachean Ethics, which is a book about living the best you can here in the everyday world. So this is a deeply symbolic representation of these two philosophers. And it's the reason they're in front of the focal point in the painting is it suggests to the viewer that Plato and Aristotle are central to all of later philosophy, which in the Western tradition they are. So a little bit of history. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are real historical individuals. But Socrates didn't leave any writings behind of his own. We only know about him from what other figures wrote about him or words that they recorded that they claimed he said. And he died in 399 BCE. More about that in a moment. Plato was deeply influenced by Socrates. And after Socrates died, he was inspired to write a number of philosophical dialogues and to found a philosophical school called the Academy. One of the students at the Academy was a young man named Aristotle. And Aristotle was clearly Plato's greatest student. But when Plato died, the leadership of the academy went to Plato's nephew, not to Aristotle. And Aristotle founded his own school, also in Athens, called the Lyceum. Now, the amount of influence that Plato and Aristotle have had in the Anglo-European tradition is huge. You almost can't overestimate it. And not just in philosophy, but also in religion. So sometimes people refer to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as the Abrahamic religions, because although Jews, Christians, and Muslims disagree about a lot, they all look upon the patriarch Abraham as their kind of spiritual grandfather, because Abraham worshiped one God. And so all the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions regard Abraham as a great prophet. And of course, these traditions developed originally independently of philosophy. But then thinkers in the Abrahamic religions read the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, and it deeply influenced how they interpreted their own religious traditions. So, for example, St. Augustine, who died in the 5th century of the Common Era, is one of the two greatest Christian philosophers. And he's very open about the fact that he was deeply influenced by the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, but especially Plato. And this colored the later history of Christianity. When Islam developed, the two greatest Islamic philosophers are generally considered to be Avicenna and Averroes. These are Latinizations of their original names. But they became very well known among Christian thinkers and admired among Christian thinkers, but also they interpreted Islam in the light of the thought of Plato and especially Aristotle. In the Jewish tradition, Maimonides is one of the greatest thinkers, and he was influenced in his interpretation of Judaism by Plato and Aristotle, but he also read and admired Avicenna and Averroes. Then the other really great Christian philosopher is Thomas Aquinas, who died in the 13th century of the Common Era. And he also was influenced by Augustine. He cited approvingly the Islamic philosophers Avicenna and Averroes, and he cited approvingly the Jewish philosopher Maimonides, because Aquinas believed that a true intellectual can learn from pagans, can learn from Jews, from Muslims, and really that wisdom is something you should share across different cultures. Well, you'll notice that when I'm talking about Christians here, I'm talking particularly about people in the Roman Catholic tradition. What about the Protestant tradition? As you probably know, Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation. And what did Martin Luther think about philosophy? Well, pardon my language, but I'm just quoting Martin Luther here, not my fault. Martin Luther said, "Philosophy is the devil's whore." He did not have a positive view about the influence of philosophy on the Christian tradition. Ironically, though, Martin Luther was himself very influenced by Augustine, and Augustine himself was influenced by Plato. So who are these figures, Plato and Aristotle, who are so important to the entire Western intellectual tradition? Let's look at their context. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle lived in ancient, and taught and learned in ancient Greece. Greece was one of the city-states in the Greek world. This chart gives you a sense of where the major Greek city-states were. They often founded colonies in other parts of the world. And as you can see, they really spread all around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea in the ancient world. And the primary form of political organization was city-states, as opposed to nation states. Nation states, as we know them now, developed later in European history. The historical context is also important, and it's also very bloody. So Plato and Socrates were both born in the 5th century BCE, and there were two major wars in this period. First, the Greco-Persian War, then the Peloponnesian War, and then after the Peloponnesian War, as part of the political ramifications of the Peloponnesian War, Socrates was executed after a kind of politically motivated show trial. Now, the Greco-Persian War is recorded by someone who's sometimes called the father of Western history, Herodotus, in his work, which is just called The History. And history, For Herodotus, historia just meant investigations or researches. And Herodotus' history is really a fun and interesting work to read, and I'd recommend it. Now, if you're like me, you might remember a movie that came out a while ago, 300, and it's actually based on a real event that occurred in the Greco-Persian War that's described by Herodotus. And this is a scene from the film 300 in which the Greek general Leonidas on the left is meeting his opponent, the Persian king Xerxes. And so in the Greco-Persian Wars, the Persians tried to invade and subjugate Greece. The Greek city-states banded together and eventually defeated the invading Persian army. So it's a really significant event in the history of the West. But also for a very long time, the fight between the Persians and the Greeks has been presented very often in a xenophobic way. And I kind of like the film 300. It is very violent and there's some nudity in it. So if you don't like those things, you won't like the film. But it's a kind of visually stunning film, and I enjoyed it for that. But it's also kind of xenophobic. Notice here that the Persian king is dark-skinned. There's an implication that he's kind of sexually perverse in the film. Leonidas is fair-skinned and rational and virtuous, not decadent like the Persians. And historically, many people on the far right in the West have appropriated the battle between the Greeks and the Persians as a symbol of the strength and rationality and virtue of the West against the decadent so-called Orient. I'll just give a shout out here. My colleagues at Vassar have a website, Pharos, Doing Justice to the Classics, which discusses articles and books that appropriate classical history for far-right, xenophobic, or fascist agendas. So it's worth taking a look at. But in any case, the Greeks were very proud of having defeated the Persians, and they'd shown their military prowess, and they also worked together. But in the decades following that, there were two major players in the Greek world, democratic Athens and its allies, and authoritarian and militaristic Sparta and its allies. And gradually, the two of them increasingly came into conflict. And this finally broke in the Peloponnesian War, in which Athens and its allies fought Sparta and its allies. And this is recorded, the events of this are recorded in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which is sometimes, I'm told, taught at the US military academies for the insights it gives even today into geopolitics. But the effects of the Peloponnesian War were disastrous. It was a stalemate for a long time because Athens had a defensive wall that even the powerful Spartan military couldn't overcome. But plague broke out inside the wall in Athens and decimated Athenian population. And as a result, the Spartans eventually won. But the war was devastating for both sides. At the end of the war, the Peloponnesian War, the victorian Spartans instituted in Athens a government by 30 authoritarian people called the 30 tyrants. And among the 30 tyrants were friends and relatives of young Plato. And Plato was invited to join the 30 tyrants, but he was young and he decided to just see what they would do. And he was horrified by the corruption, cruelty, and injustice of his friends and relatives among the 30 tyrants who took over Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War. Eventually, the 30 tyrants were deposed, and a democratic, with a small d, democratic government, a popular government, then took over in Athens again. And Plato thought, well, now we're going to have justice and we're going to have a wise government now that the 30 tyrants have been deposed. But Plato was horrified because the democratic government was just as unjust, just as cruel, and just as lacking in wisdom and insight as the 30 tyrants had been. In fact, because Socrates had been a friend of some of the people who were among the 30 tyrants and had been associated with some of them, they brought him up on trumped up charges of corrupting the youth of Athens and eventually sentenced Socrates to death. And this is a very famous painting, Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Socrates. It shows Socrates here after he's been unjustly convicted of corrupting the youth. All Socrates was doing was going around asking people, how do they know that what they believe is true is actually true? And Socrates famously said, the one thing I know is that I know nothing, but at least I'm wiser than other people in that respect, that I know nothing, whereas other people know nothing and think they know something. But in fairness, Socrates could be a very annoying person to talk to. And so after his trial, he was sentenced to death and forced to drink hemlock as a poison to execute him. Here, he's shown courageously, bravely taking the hemlock. And notice, in an echo of Raphael's School of Athens, he's gesturing up, meaning, don't be afraid. I'm not afraid. My soul is leaving the prison of the body. So he's shown here in a prison, but metaphorically, he's leaving the prison of the body when he drinks the hemlock. And although his companions are sad, Socrates is shown as being very brave because he knows that when his soul leaves his body, nothing bad will happen to it. He also looks really buff, which is kind of surprising for an ancient Athenian of his age. But anyway, it's an artistic romanticization of Socrates' death. But it's based on Plato's account of what it was like the day that Socrates died. So Plato was deeply affected by these events in Athens, and he recounts his experience in this autobiographical seventh letter, which is really fascinating. He says, finally, it became clear to me, with regard to all existing communities, that they were one and all misgoverned, for their laws have got into a state that is almost incurable. And I was forced to say, when praising true philosophy, that it is by this that men are enabled to see what justice in public and private life really is. Therefore, I said, there will be no cessation of evils for the sons of men, till either those who are pursuing a right and true philosophy receive sovereign power in the states, or those in power in the states, by some dispensation of providence, become true philosophers. And what does Plato mean by philosophy here? He doesn't mean people who are just nerds like me. A true philosopher for Plato, philosophy, of course, means philosophia, a lover of wisdom. And so someone who genuinely knows the truth and loves the truth and is committed to it could be a good ruler. And Plato, having seen the transition of power in Athens after the Peloponnesian War, says there'll be no end to trouble until true philosophers become rulers. So who is this guy, Plato? He had an aristocratic background, as we saw. He was wealthy. He was supposedly a very big, imposing man and a great wrestler. He wrote a number of philosophical dialogues. The Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, and Phaedo are four that go together kind of nicely. They're centered around the Apology. The Apology is Socrates' defense speech at his trial. And the name's a little unfortunate. Apology is from the Greek apologia, meaning defense. There's nothing apologetic about the Apology. In fact, Socrates is kind of rude to the jurors, and he mocks them, saying that they should thank him for what he's been doing in Athens by exposing the ignorance of others rather than condemning him. The Euthyphro is a dialogue about filial piety, about piety to the gods. That occurs when Socrates is on the way to the trial. The Crito is a dialogue about why we should obey the laws of the state that takes place after Socrates has been convicted and when he's waiting in prison, awaiting his execution. And the Phaedo is a dialogue about the immortality of the soul, which supposedly took place on the day that Socrates drank the hemlock and died. And David's painting is based on the Phaedo. In addition to these, the Symposium is a wonderful dialogue about the nature of love, in which people give different speeches with different accounts of the true nature of love. The notion of Platonic love develops in the Symposium, and it had a great influence on how we think about love even today. But I'm going to be talking mostly today about the Republic, which is a book-length dialogue in which Plato uses Socrates as his spokesperson in describing the ideal state, the nature of human life, and what it means to live a good life. So the Republic is an extended dialogue. This is an ancient version of it that's got the Greek text, a Latin translation, and a bunch of notes here. It's a good question why Plato himself never speaks in the first person in his dialogues. He almost always has Socrates be a spokesperson. And this is called the Socratic question. What was Socrates' real view, and why does Plato always use him as a spokesperson? Interesting to think about. Won't be going into it too much today. But one of the things that Plato has Socrates say in the Republic is that if we want to understand what virtues like justice are, or what justice is in a community, it's easier to see justice in a big thing like the city-state, and then look for the corresponding state in the soul. And Socrates has this view, or Plato gives Socrates this view, that there's a correspondence between the macrocosm, that is to say the universe as a whole, and the state, and the microcosm, that is to say the individual and the individual soul. And he says, in the state, there are really three classes. There are guardians, people who rule the city. There are what he calls auxiliaries, who are people who protect the city from external and internal threats. That's what we would call like the police and the military. And there are the wealth makers, the people who produce goods and services. And in an ideal state, the rulers, the people who rule the city, are those in whom the rational part of the soul is dominant. And the rational part of the soul is the part that knows the truth about ethics and knows the truth about what we would call science and history and factual matters. The auxiliaries, the kind of person who's good to have in the police or the military, is somebody in whom the spirited part of the soul is dominant. The spirited part of the soul is the part of the soul that feels anger and shame about dishonor. And then the people who are going to be wealth makers are people in whom the appetitive part of the soul, the part of the soul that has physical desires, is dominant. Now, according to Plato, everybody's soul has all three parts. You've got a rational part, a spirited part, and an appetitive part. And what makes you appropriate to be a particular social class is that that part of your soul is dominant. But every class has every part to some extent. And in a well-governed society, the three classes of society are comfortably hierarchically organized. So the rulers, the guardians, are the people who have the most highly developed rational aspect of their soul, and they dominate in society. They guide others for the benefit of the others. The auxiliaries are people in the police and the military. Their spirited part of their soul, the kind that is anger or has anger or shame about dishonorable things, is dominant in their soul, but they take guidance from the guardians about what they should feel anger or shame about. And then the wealth makers accept the guidance of the auxiliaries and the guidance of the guardians about how they should accumulate wealth and what ways of accumulating wealth are appropriate or inappropriate. And of course, I'm sure you recognize as my example of a guardian, Abraham Lincoln here. Lincoln was, although not highly educated formally, he was an intellectual, and he was very proud of being well-read. Lincoln said that one of the things he was most proud of was that he had read and understood Euclid's Elements, which is an ancient classic of geometry. In addition, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is modeled on the funeral oration of Pericles, which is recorded in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. As an auxiliary here, this is General Patton, a famous general in World War II, also himself a bit of an intellectual, but also a very spirited person. And then, of course, as our sample wealth maker here, we have Bill Gates. Now, according to Plato, in a just society, those with reason rule and the wealthy obey. In contrast, in a society that is badly functioning, those who are wealthy dominate, those who are spirited in the military and the police force also do not listen to the guidance of those who genuinely have reason. So ideal society, those whose faculty of reason is highly developed are in charge. In an unjust society, according to Plato, those who have wealth are the ones making the decisions and telling those who have reason what they should believe and what they should do. So I know Plato's philosophy is a little complicated, but in plain language, what is Plato saying is the key to living well? We all want to live well. We all want to live the good life. So what is Plato telling us is the key to living well? Well, Plato says, if you want to live well, you need to know what's actually going on in the world, and you need to know what is really valuable. This happens when the rational part of your mind has wisdom. In addition to live well, your physical desires need to defer to your best judgment about when and how to satisfy them. This happens when the appetitive part of your mind has moderation or self-control, so it follows the rational part. In addition, your anger and your sense of shame should also be guided by your best judgment and not just follow random fads or unsubstantiated opinions. This happens when the spirited part of your mind has courage. And finally, you shouldn't let your anger or your physical desires do your thinking for you. And you can avoid this if your mind has justice, so that each part of your mind does only the task that is best suited for it. So for Plato, there are four key virtues: wisdom, justice, moderation, and courage. And you have these things when your soul is well organized and every part of your soul is doing the task it should be doing. And your society is well organized when the people in whom the various aspects of the soul that are dominant are doing the tasks that are appropriate for people who have that part of themselves dominant, and they are hierarchically organized, so they're listening to the guidance of people who know better than they are, know better than they do. So what are virtue and vice then like in the soul? What is it like to be a virtuous person, or what is it like to be a vicious or a bad person? Plato suggests that injustice or vice must be like a kind of civil war between the three parts of your soul, a rebellion by some part against the whole soul in order to rule it inappropriately. Virtue, then, seems to be a kind of health, fine condition, and well-being of the soul, while vice is disease, shameful condition, and weakness. And he asks, don't fine ways of living lead one to the possession of virtue, and shameful ones to vice? Now, if you think about virtue and vice this way, or you think about what it is to live well or to live badly this way, you start to realize that it's actually in your interest to be a virtuous person. And it's actually not worth living to be a vicious person, even if you had a bunch of other apparent goods. So is it more profitable to be virtuous or vicious? Plato says, look, even if one has every kind of food and drink, lots of money, and every sort of power to rule, even if someone can do whatever he wishes, except what will free him from vice and injustice and make him acquire justice and virtue, how can it be worth living when his soul, the very thing by which he lives, is ruined and in turmoil? So Plato says, imagine somebody who's got lots of money, they've got lots of social prestige, they have lots of influence, but their individual psychology, because our word psychology, if the talk about soul seems strange to you, our word psychology comes from the Greek for a rational account, logos, of the soul, psyche. And so if your psychology is disordered and inharmonious, even if you had a bunch of external goods, would you really want to be that kind of person? Would you really want to lead that kind of life? What would it be like to be that kind of person? What kind of person would have wealth and prestige and social influence, but have a disordered soul, and you'd think, wow, I'd never want to be them, even though they have a bunch of external goods? But my students often point out at this point, they say, well, but many people disagree with Plato about living well. Or maybe we think that, like, no, even if you gave me the wealth of Paris Hilton, I'd never want to be Paris Hilton. Or even if you gave me the social cachet of Britney Spears, I'd never want to be Britney Spears because her life just doesn't seem happy. But there are people who disagree with us. Plato was aware of this. But just because people disagree with you and just because you can't convince them doesn't mean they're right. This is Mark Sargent, and this is a clip from a delightful documentary on Netflix called Behind the Curve, which is about people who believe that the Earth is flat. And Mr. Sargent here is holding up a model of what he actually believes the Earth is like. He thinks the Earth is a flat disk surrounded by an ice wall. And as it becomes clear in this Netflix documentary, you can't talk flat earthers out of their belief that the Earth is flat. But the fact that they disagree with us doesn't give us less confidence in our belief that the Earth is approximately spherical. And this is a point that Plato makes in the dialogue, the Crito. Plato has Socrates says, one should greatly value some people's opinions, but not others. And one should value the good opinions and not the bad ones, right? The good opinions are those of wise men, the bad ones, those of foolish men. So with other matters, and certainly with actions just and unjust, shameful and beautiful, good and bad, about which we are now deliberating. Should we follow the opinion of the many and fear it, or that of the one, if there is one, who has knowledge of these things? So Plato says, oh, I'm sure there's lots of people who want to have lives that we can see are actually bad lives because the people who live those lives have a psychology or a soul that's ill-ordered. But the fact that many people disagree with us shouldn't persuade us unless those people are wise. Well, another really interesting aspect of Plato's Republic, and one that was extremely controversial in its era, is that Plato believes that women can be guardians or auxiliaries. So women can be rulers, women can be philosophers, women can be mathematicians, women can serve in the military, women can be great generals, they can be great police officers. This is a great book, by the way, that just came out, The Philosopher Queens, by Buxton and Whitting, and it's got like brief biographies of a number of great women philosophers through history, if you're interested in reading about that. But in the Republic itself, Plato says, then there's no way of life concerned with the management of the city that belongs to a woman because she's a woman, or to a man because he's a man. But the various natures are distributed in the same way in both creatures. Women share by nature in every way of life, just as men do. We'll say, I suppose, that one woman is a doctor, another not, and that one is musical by nature, another not. Further, isn't one woman philosophical or a lover of wisdom, while another hates wisdom? Then women of this sort must be chosen along with men of the same sort to live with them and share their guardianship, seeing that they are adequate for the task and akin to the men in nature. So Plato admits that men and women are different by nature, but he says, but the kind of nature you want in a guardian is somebody in whom the rational part is dominant. And whether or not they're male or female is irrelevant to that. The kind of person you want as an auxiliary is somebody in whom the spirited part is dominant. And that's a separate question from whether or not they happen to have a male or a female nature. Let's go back for a moment to Aristotle. You recall that Aristotle was Plato's student at the academy and went on to be, along with Plato, one of the two most influential philosophers in the entire Western tradition. He was also, Aristotle was, tutor to Alexander the Great, who conquered almost all the known world, including the Greek world, what's now Egypt, and even parts of what is now India. And the tutor of Alexander the Great was Aristotle. In Dante's Divine Comedy, which is a kind of summation of the wisdom of the European Middle Ages and a great work of literature, Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates are presented in limbo. They're not in heaven. They can't be in heaven because they're not Christian, but they're virtuous pagans. So Dante says that they are eternally in limbo engaging in conversation, denied the joys of heaven, but also saved from the torments of hell. And in Limbo, Dante describes Aristotle as the master of those who know, reflecting the huge influence and respect people had for Aristotle in the Middle Ages. But Aristotle was also deeply sexist. He argued that women are naturally subordinate to men. In fact, he said notoriously that the female is, as it were, a male deformed. A woman is a deformed man. Nature tries to produce men, its highest expression of existence in the material realm, but when nature fails to produce a man, it produces a woman who's just a deformed man. Another interesting fact about Aristotle, or at least something that was widely believed in the Middle Ages, is that Aristotle was a submissive to Phyllis, who was Alexander the Great's mistress. Alexander the Great supposedly had a mistress named Phyllis, and the story goes that she heard Aristotle saying that men are all superior to women, and so Phyllis seduced Aristotle and made him carry her around like a little pony. And this is a very old story, whether it's true or not. This is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a statue depicting Phyllis riding Aristotle. This is a more modern representation of the same story. And it represents people suggesting, and some people actually did explicitly suggest this, that Aristotle had a lot of animosity towards women because he had failed in a love affair, or because he was jealous of women, or he just had issues with women, and that's why he said it. But, you know, it's easy to mock Aristotle from our perspective for his views about women, but remember Raphael's school of Athens, which I showed you at the beginning, where Plato's gesturing up, Aristotle's gesturing down. That has multiple significance. Part of the significance is Plato wants you to transcend your commonsensical opinions. Whereas for Aristotle, philosophy is about refining common sense. So for Aristotle, you're not supposed to transcend common sense. And the common sense of his era was that women were naturally inferior to men. So Aristotle just expressed that in his philosophy, whereas Plato was willing to reject even what seemed like very commonsensical views about the nature of women. So this leads to the last thing I'm going to talk about in Plato's Republic. In Book 7 of the Republic, there's a famous allegory of the cave. And this is an artistic representation of the allegory of the cave. And the allegory of the cave is Plato's way of saying that the true philosopher has to reject a lot of commonsensical views, because so many commonsensical views are just mistaken, they're illusory. The allegory of the cave is complicated, but the basic details are that Plato asks us to imagine that there are prisoners in a cave and they're shackled, so they can't look left or right, and they can't get up. All they can do is look at a wall of the cave. On the wall of the cave are shadows, and these shadows are projected by a fire, which is behind people. And then there are models of various things on a wall in front of the fire. And the people in the cave see the shadows of reality, not even shadows of reality, shadows of models of reality, and they take those shadows to be real. But then the true philosopher is the one who breaks free from the shackles of the cave and emerges out of the cave and sees the real things in the world above. And now they know what reality is like, and now they know that what people take to be real are really just a bunch of illusions, shadows on the wall of a cave. And they go back down in the cave and they try to tell people, you're just looking at shadows, you're not seeing reality. But the people in the cave think that they're mad, they think that they're insane, and they get angry with them for telling them that they're just looking at shadows. By the way, this is a clip from George Lucas's early film, THX 1138. And you can see the last 5 minutes of the film on YouTube, and I recommend it. He must have been inspired by the myth of Plato's cave. But Plato's basic vision is you've got to escape the cave of illusion and see the world as it actually is. And this is fun. This is a pug kind of illustrating the Plato's cave. This pug is trying to drink the shadow of the water rather than the actual water. And Plato's telling us most of us are like this pug. We're taking shadows to be the actual reality. We have to break free from the shackles. Now, Plato's cave has actually had a lot of historical influence. Aristotle's science was dominant in the European Middle Ages. And why was Aristotelian science dominant? There's a lot of things actually in favor of Aristotelian science, a lot of things you could admire about Aristotelian science. But the key thing about Aristotle's scientific views is, like his views on ethics, Aristotle's science just refines common sense. So Aristotle says the sun revolves around the earth and the earth does not move. Why? Well, isn't that common sense? Doesn't it look like the sun is moving? Doesn't it feel like the earth is not moving? In addition, Aristotle claimed that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. Isn't that just common sense? You drop a rock, you drop a feather, which one's going to land first? The rock, right? And Aristotle suggested that an object in motion will slow down and stop moving if nothing pushes it. So something must be making the planets continue to move, because the natural motion of any object is to slow down once something stops pushing it. Just common sense. You ever thrown a rock? You ever thrown a spear? They travel for a while after you push them, but then they slow down and they stop. So that must be how things naturally act. Now, I'm not claiming that Plato invented modern science, because he didn't. Plato had a bunch of views about the world which were fundamentally mistaken. He did know the Earth was spherical, as did Aristotle, and so he was ahead of contemporary flat earthers. But Plato did have mistaken views. But the people who invented and developed modern science, people like Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, they were explicit that they were following Plato. Why? Because they mathematized the world the way Plato said the world is ultimately mathematized in the Timaeus. And they realize that the true structure of reality often violates common sense. And so you have to leave the illusions of the cave behind to understand the way the world actually is. It doesn't seem like the earth is spinning like a top while zooming around the sun, but it is. If objects accelerate down towards the center of the earth at the same rate, if you neglect air resistance. It's not obvious to common sense, but that is in fact what is true. In addition, an object in motion will stay in motion unless a force acts on it. Doesn't seem like it makes sense to common sense, but it is the way the world actually is. Plato's also had a considerable influence in ethics and politics. We've seen the way in which he influenced views about the capacities of women. And there have been many great philosophers in the past, like Hypatia, I pointed out in Raphael's painting. Christine de Pizan was a medieval female philosopher who appealed to Plato's ideas about the equality of women to argue that women could be philosophers. Lucretia Maranella was an early modern philosopher who explicitly appealed to Plato in arguing for the superiority of women over men. And interestingly, Martin Luther King Jr. was also influenced by Plato. In an interview, Martin Luther King Jr. was asked, next to the Bible, what is his favorite book? The interviewer knew that he was a Protestant minister. And so obviously the Bible is going to be his favorite book. But the interviewer said, well, next to the Bible, what's your favorite book? And King said it was Plato's Republic. And King, in fact, studied and taught philosophy, including Plato's Republic. And if you look at some of his most interesting philosophical works, Letter from Birmingham Jail is a fascinating work of philosophy and one of the great classics of American philosophy, the influence of Platonic ideas is clear. King said, just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, we must see the need of having nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men to rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So King lived in a society where the common sense was that African Americans were inferior to white Americans. He lived in a society where the common sense was that racial segregation was the norm. But he said, if you follow reason, you will come to realize that races are equal. You will come to realize that segregation is wrong. And he uses the Platonic language of ascent from the myths and the darkness of the cave to the light of truth. He also says that society needs nonviolent gadflies. That is a specific reference to Socrates' apology, his unapologetic apology. And Socrates says to the people of Athens that you're lucky that you have me because you Athenians are lethargic, like a tired old horse. And I'm like a gadfly that wakes you from your slumbers by asking you hard questions. And so King was specifically identifying himself with nonviolent questioners like Socrates. So the influence of Plato's ideas has been immense. Does Plato have anything to teach us today? Well, Plato tells us that you should worry about the possibility that you might be a person who's just sitting looking at shadows being projected on the wall. And one aspect of the cave allegory that I didn't really stress, but that's kind of interesting, is Plato says there are people who are moving the models back and forth in front of the fire and making them cast the shadows on the wall. And Plato suggested you have to ask yourself, what is reality? Are the shadows that I'm seeing on the wall the true reality? And who is it who's projecting those shadows on the wall? And what is the real truth behind the shadows, and even the real truth behind the models which are being used to project those shadows on the wall? So Plato would invite you to think about what kind of shadows you watch and whether those shadows actually give you the truth. I'm Professor Bryan Van Norden of Vassar College. This has been my lecture about what we can learn from the ancient philosophers, hosted by One Day University. Thank you very much for your time. Well, thank you very much for listening to my talk. I've got some terrific questions from the audience that I'd like to address. Someone asked, is Socrates the source for the phrase question everything, or at least the inspiration for the same? Yes, I think he was. Socrates used to go around Athens, and the story that he tells actually in the Apology, his trial speech, is that a friend of his asked the oracle at Delphi whether there was anybody in Athens who was wiser than Socrates. And the oracle responded, no, there is no one wiser than Socrates. And Socrates says that he was actually very surprised by this, because Socrates said, I don't know anything. And so how could I be the wisest person in all of Greece? So he said he would go around and try to find somebody wiser than himself. So he went around and he talked to entertainers, and he talked to business people, merchants of various kinds, and politicians. And he said each of them thought they knew a lot, and many of them had a reputation for being very clever. And they might be clever in some one particular thing, like in making money, or he said actors are clever at acting. But as soon as Socrates asked them questions and said, well, you claim to know this, how do you know that that's true? It turned out that they couldn't answer his questions. They couldn't give an account of what the basis was of their claims to knowledge. And after going through a bunch of people, Socrates concludes, well, you know what? I don't know anything. And the people I'm talking to don't really know anything either. But at least I know that I don't know anything. So Socrates said, this is what the gods were telling us with the oracle. What they meant was Socrates is wisest because although he knows nothing, at least he knows that he knows nothing. So Socrates said it was a divine injunction of his to go and expose the ignorance of other people. And as you can imagine, that was really annoying. And Socrates didn't help his case by being, very in your face and rude about this at his own trial. So he was not only found guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens and failing to believe in the gods of the state, but he was so rude in the sentencing phase of the trial that he was sentenced to death by an even larger margin than he was found guilty of corrupting the youth. And again, all that he was doing when he was being accused of corrupting the youth was asking questions and asking, how do you know that? So yes, in a way, Socrates is the basis for this notion that you should question everything. Now, another great question I was asked is Wuhan University in Wuhan, China, and do you speak Chinese? And I guess that's from the introductory materials about me. Yes, I'm also in addition to being James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar, I also have the honor of being a chair professor in the School of Philosophy at Wuhan University in Wuhan, China. Yes, that is in Wuhan, China. Yes, that is the place where the COVID apparently started. No one there eats bats. I'm not an epidemiologist, but the reasons for the start of COVID don't have to do with people eating bats in Wuhan, China. People in China don't eat bats. I just like to mention that defensively because Wuhan's a very sophisticated and very modern city that just happened to have an unfortunate outbreak that started there. Although someone else asks, although Atlantis is a myth, could it have been at least partially inspired by the Minoan civilization on Crete that was destroyed by the volcanic eruption on nearby Santorini? Yeah, there's a lot of theories about why ancient Minoan civilization disappeared. One theory is that the nearby volcanic eruption on Santorini may have adversely affected the civilization. It didn't completely destroy the civilization the way that Pompeii was destroyed, but it may have had a negative effect on the civilization. And certainly Plato was aware that there were earlier civilizations that no longer existed. This was like a common knowledge in the ancient world. So he may have been inspired by that. But I do like to stress that Atlantis is itself a myth because I meet so many otherwise intelligent, well-informed people who are very surprised by this and surprised that we really don't have any other source of the story of Atlantis than Plato. And if you're used to reading Plato, you can tell when Plato's making a clear joke. And he very clearly sets up Atlantis as a joke in the sense that it's clearly supposed to be a myth, but a myth he is going to use to illustrate what an ideal civilization, like the one described in the Republic, was like. And so that's why he brings up the myth, but he's clearly setting it up as something that's supposed to be mythical. That's a great question. Another great question, someone says, when I was a philosophy major in the 1980s, we studied classical philosophy. Has that changed as the canon of literature has, as not being inclusive enough? Well, it varies. Every major research institution that teaches doctoral students in philosophy has someone on staff who can teach ancient Western philosophy. And I teach at Vassar. We have a specialist in ancient Western philosophy who teaches here. He regularly teaches courses every year on ancient Western philosophy, including Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and other figures like Heraclitus and Parmenides. I regularly teach Plato and Aristotle in my courses as well. So I think the continued teaching of classical philosophy is not on the way out. I wrote a response recently to an editorial that came out in the New York Times about canceling Aristotle, because Aristotle, as we saw, has very sexist views about women, and also Aristotle defended slavery. And so this was an editorial about why we shouldn't cancel Aristotle. And in my response to that editorial, which you can find on Medium, where I respond to this, and my piece is called "Who is Canceling Aristotle? The Panic Over the Imaginary Threat to the Canon." I point out that actually no one's canceling Aristotle. In fact, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics continues to be one of the most widely taught, one of the 10 most widely taught texts in universities around the country. And in addition, Aristotle's Poetics and his Politics, two other works he wrote, are among the top 100 most widely assigned works. So people are still very much teaching Plato and Aristotle, and I think that's a good thing, although I'd like to see even more people being aware of them. A lot of my work is about Chinese philosophy, and I do read classical Chinese, and I speak a bit of modern Chinese, and I'd like to see the canon of Western philosophy expand so that it includes not just Plato and Aristotle, but also great Confucian thinkers like Confucius himself and Mengzi, great Taoist thinkers like Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, who's another great philosopher in the Taoist tradition, not as well known in the West. And in fact, I've done another talk for One Day University, which you can find on the website, entitled "Who Was Confucius and What Did He Really Say?" Because I think Western philosophy is wonderful, but I also think Indian philosophy is wonderful, and East Asian philosophy is also fascinating. And I think people can really learn from that. Another question. I think the third class in Plato's society should be defined as those who produce goods and services. As you said, they are not necessarily wealthy like Bill Gates. Good point. I mean, the wealth producing class is not necessarily wealthy. So if you're a farmer who's just getting by, or you're a beautician, or you're a sailor, or you're a merchant in a small shop, in Plato's society, you're part of the wealth-producing class. And some people in this class may become very wealthy, but it also includes people who are just ordinary working people as we would understand them. So not everybody in the wealth-producing class is very wealthy. But there were merchants in Athens in Plato's time who became extremely wealthy. And in his society, as in ours, that wealth sometimes gave them political influence and power. And interestingly, in some of the books in the Republic that we didn't really have a chance to talk about very much, some of the later books, Plato talks about how even a perfect ideal society can decay. And he says, in the most ideal society, people are guided by reason. That can decay into a society that's guided just by honor, where the spirited part of the soul, where you're concerned about shame and honor, is dominant. And so you become a society guided just by honor. And then from that, you can decay to a society that's guided just by the pursuit of wealth. And he says the danger in that kind of society is that ultimately it can transform from a flourishing state to a dictatorship. And he says the person, this is Plato speaking, Plato says the person most likely to transform a democracy into a dictatorship is a wealthy business leader who will convince the masses that he is on their side. That's Plato's diagnosis more than 2,000 years ago of how a democracy can descend into tyranny. I'm almost out of time. Let's see if I have time for one more quick question. I've got a bunch of great questions here. I wish I could answer them all. How does Plato's philosophy relate to Western political conservatism? That's a great question. The conservative, liberal, or right-wing, left-wing divide, as we know it, really started to develop later in history, and even that has transformed a lot over the last 100 years. The meaning of the term liberal has changed a lot, and people who would have been considered liberal in, say, the 18th century would be considered conservative by some definitions today. But both some people who would be considered left-wing or liberal by our standards and some people who would be considered right-wing or conservative by our standards have been inspired by Plato. So The main thing I think to get about Plato's philosophy and Aristotle's philosophy as well is that both of them take human beings to be primarily social animals, animals who only really flourish in a community as a whole. And this is different from a lot of modern political thinkers like Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes, who take humans to be fundamentally independent individuals who then contract to form a social contract. Anyway, I'm sorry that we're about out of time now. I've enjoyed your questions very much. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. Again, I'm Professor Bryan Van Norden of Vassar College, and this has been my talk on what we can learn from the ancient philosophers, hosted by One Day University.